Question 63 of the Summa Theologia is the second to last of the questions in the Treatise on the Angels, and also it's the first of two that is going to have to do with the demons. The first one is the malice of the angels with regard to sin, here in question number 63, and then the final question is going to be having to do with the punishment of the demons in regard to the sin that they do commit. So that'll close out the Treatise on the Angels, and then we'll go on to creation, and then human nature, and then governance of the world to close out Prima Pars, the first part of the Summa. So this particular question has 9 articles. It's kind of long, but we'll go through it pretty quickly, but they are very interesting. I think you're going to enjoy this. And Article 1 says whether the evil of fault can be in the angels. And so this is kind of a simple question. St. Thomas Aquinas is just saying, can the angels sin? Are they capable of sinning? Because not all creatures can sin. The irrational creatures cannot sin. We know that we can sin, but what about the angels? And so he says an angel or any other rational creature considered in his own nature can sin, and to whatever creature it belongs not to sin, such creature has it as a gift of grace and not from the condition of nature. And so that's an interesting point, because obviously the irrational creatures can't sin, but I don't think he's talking about irrational creatures here. I think my guess is that he's talking about a creature like the Blessed Mother, who did not sin, but she had a special grace, and even Adam and Eve, to some degree, were preserved from at least sins of the flesh, because that was a special grace that they were given before original sin, right? Because sinning is nothing else than a deviation from that rectitude which an act ought to have. Ought is a very important word in philosophy, because when you talk about ought, you're talking about ethics. How ought we live? Not how things are, but how ought they be? And they ought to be a certain way, right? If you're talking about ethics. Whether we speak of sin in nature, art, or morals, that act alone, the rule of which is the very virtue of the agent, can never fall short of rectitude. Then he goes on and says, the divine will is the sole rule of God's act, because it is not referred to any higher end. Okay, God is not trying to achieve some higher end. He is the end, right? But he is the bar to which we are going to have to conform ourselves and our actions to. But every created will has rectitude of act so far only as it is regulated according to the divine will, to which the last end is to be referred. Okay, so that's the first article. Obviously, the angels can sin, and to the degree that they do not live according to the divine will, and also eternal law, which we'll be talking about in a future question. That will be sin. All right, whether only the sin of pride and envy can exist in the angel. Now, of course, we've already learned that the angels are incorporeal creatures, so they don't have bodies, they don't have senses, they don't have passions, and so that really eliminates a lot of sins. They can't have sins of lust, they can't have sins of gluttony, they can't, be lazy, right? So what's left? Well, what's left is pride and envy. But there is one little caveat here that in one way the angels are able to commit those other sins. As St. Thomas explains here, he says sin can exist in a subject in 2 ways. First of all, by actual guilt, and secondly, by affection. As to guilt, all sins are in the demons, since by leading men to sin, they incur the guilt of all sins. So if an angel, I should say, guides a man into a sin of lust, well, the angel is guilty of that sin as well, just like we would be guilty if we led our friend into a sin. Because of our persuasion he sinned, well, then we would have some guilt as well. But as to affection only, those sins can be in the demons which can belong to a spiritual nature. Now, spiritual nature cannot be affected by such pleasures as appertain to bodies, but only as such as are in keeping with spiritual things, because nothing is affected except with regard to something which is in some way suited to its nature. But there can be no sin when anyone is incited to good of the spiritual order, unless in such an affection the superior be not kept. Such is precisely the sin of pride, not to be subject to a superior when subjection is due. Consequently, the first sin of the angel is none other than pride. Now, that's obviously a buzzword in our culture today, which you hear often about pride, and so that's one of only two sins that the demons can actually commit, right? The angels can commit. Yet, as a consequence, it was possible for envy also to be in them, since for the appetite to tend to the desire of something involves on its part resistance to anything contrary. Now, the envious man repines over the good possessed by another, inasmuch as he deems his neighbor's good to be a hindrance of his own. After the sin of pride, there followed the evil of envy in the sinning angel, whereby he grieved over man's good and also over the divine excellence, according as against the devil's will God makes use of man for divine glory. Okay, what's he talking about here? Well, Jesus had a human nature, right? The angels had to clearly submit to Jesus as a divine person, but he did have a human nature, so that was kind of a blow to their pride. And also the Blessed Mother. I mean, she's not even divine, and she is the queen of the angels, and so the angels had to submit to her as well. Article 3, whether the devil desired to be as God. Now, this one, as you might expect, is a little nuanced as well, as often Thomas's answers are. He says, without doubt, the angel sinned by seeking to be as God. But this can be understood in two ways. There's a lot of two ways in these articles. First, by equality, and secondly, by likeness. He could not seek to be as God in the first way because by natural knowledge, he knew that this was impossible. Okay, and there was no habit preceding his first sinful act, nor any passion fettering his mind, so as to lead him to choose what was impossible by falling in some particular. Okay, so Thomas is going to go on and say here that it's impossible to sin by desiring something that's absolutely and utterly impossible. And the angels know they are not going to be God in their essence, right? And he goes on to say that no creature desires to be a species or a creature above them, because by doing so, you would have to cease to exist. So if I desire to be an angel, for example, I would cease to exist because I'm not an angel and I can only be a better human being. I can't be an angel, so I would cease to exist and then begin to exist as an entirely different creature altogether. So it's kind of an interesting point that he makes. Then he goes on to say, to desire to be as God according to likeness can happen in two ways. In one way, as to the likeness whereby everything is made to be likened unto God. Okay, we are like unto God, and so that's a good thing. And so if anyone desires in this way to be godlike, he commits no sin, provided that he desires such likeness in proper order, that is to say, that he may obtain it by God. But he would sin if he would desire to be like unto God, even in the right way, as of his own and not God's power. In another way, one may desire to be like unto God in some respect which is not natural to one, as if one were to desire to create heaven and earth. Okay, so you want to be like God, and you want to have his powers, and you want to be able to do things that God does alone. So that could be a way that the devil would have desired to be like God, to kind of assume the power that God has. All right, are demons naturally wicked? Okay, this is an interesting question. Everything which exists, insofar as it exists and has a particular nature, tends naturally to some good. Okay, this is very classic Aquinas optimism, that everything in the world, without exception, desires the good. Okay, this is just part of the nature of things that are good, right? Since it comes from a good principle, because the effect always reverts to the principle. Now, a particular good may happen to have some evil connected with it, and thus fire has evil connected with it because it consumes other things. But with the universal good, no evil can be connected. If then there be anything whose nature is inclined towards some particular good, it can tend naturally to some evil, not as evil, but accidentally, okay, as connected with some good. But if anything of its nature be inclined to good in general, then of its own nature it cannot be inclined to evil. Now it is manifest that every intellectual nature is inclined towards good in general, which it can apprehend, and which is the object of the will. Hence, since the demons are intellectual substances, they can no wise have a natural inclination towards any evil whatsoever. Consequently, they cannot be naturally evil. Isn't that interesting? I think most people would think that the demons are naturally evil. Article 5, whether the devil was wicked by the fault of his own will in the first instant of his creation. Now, I'm just going to kind of summarize this one, because St. Thomas Aquinas, for whatever reason, wants to get very, very particular as to when did the demons sin, right? So we know that they were created, and all of the knowledge that they naturally know is going to be infused in them at that moment. Okay, and that's a good thing. And so what Thomas is going to argue here is that it's not possible for at that exact same moment, exactly at that moment when God is doing something really good and creating a good creature, that there could at the same time be this choice of evil. So what he's going to say is, rather than it being instantaneous, there's going to be a little bit of a delay, even if it's just a microsecond. Okay, in the next instant, that's when he's going to fall. And this is what he takes up in Article 6, whether there was any interval between the creation and the fall of the angel. And he will say, yes, there was a very, very brief interval. There is a twofold opinion on this point, but the more probable one, which is also more in harmony with the teaching of the saints, is that the devil sinned at once at the first instant of it. Okay, at once after the first instant of his creation. This must be maintained if it be held that he elicited an act of free will in the first instant of creation, and that he was created in grace. For since the angels attained beatitude by one meritorious act, as was said above, if the devil created in grace merited in the first instant, he would have at once received beatitude after that first instant if he had not placed an impediment by sinning. Okay, so he received the grace of creation, of being good, being ordained to the good, like we just learned about, and then he placed an impediment by the willing, not God and not obedience, and not in sinning by pride and envy, he fell, okay, in the instant afterwards. If, however, it be contended that the angel was not created in grace, or that he could not elicit an act of free will in the first instant, then there is nothing to prevent some interval being interposed between his creation and the fall. Okay, so there was a little bit of an interval. Okay, the final two articles here, whether the highest angel among those who sinned was the highest of all. Okay, was the angel who fell the highest of all the angels? And surprise, surprise, Thomas is going to look at this in two different ways. He said two things have to be considered in sin, namely the proneness to sin and the motive for sinning. If then in the angels we consider the proneness to sin, it seems that the higher angels were less likely to sin than the lower. On this account, Damascene says, St. Damascene, that the highest of those who sinned was set over the terrestrial order. Okay, so that wasn't the highest overall. That was just the highest of the one who sinned. This opinion seems to agree with the view of the Platonists, which Augustine quotes. For they said that all the gods were good, gods with quotation marks, the angels, whereas some of the demons were good and some bad, naming as gods the intellectual substances which are above the lunar sphere, and calling by the name of demons the intellectual substances which are beneath it, yet higher than men in the order of nature. Nor is this opinion to be rejected as contrary to faith, because the whole corporeal creation is governed by God through the angels. So he's saying, gosh, this is what Damascene said, this is what Augustine said, the Platonists said. He doesn't want to disagree with these bright church luminaries, right? But then he says, consequently, there is nothing to prevent us from saying that the lower angels were divinely set aside for presiding over the lower bodies, the higher over the higher bodies, and the highest to stand before God. So in this scheme, it wasn't the very highest who fell first. It was the highest among the lowest, if that makes sense. Then he says, but if the motive for sinning be considered, we find that it existed in the higher angels more than in the lower. For it has been said, the demon's sin was pride, and the motive of pride is excellence, which was greater in the higher spirits. Hence Gregory said that he who sinned was the very highest of all. This seems to be the more probable view, because the angel's sin did not come of any proneness, but of free choice alone. Yet this must not be prejudicial to the other view, because there might be some motive for sinning in him who also was the chief of the lower angels. So what Thomas is doing here is he's trying to be respectful of all the doctors that preceded him and saying, okay, they didn't agree with each other. This is probably what it was. But at the same time, he's very reluctant to disagree with people like Augustine and Damascene. Okay. So number 8, whether the sin of the highest angel was the cause of the others sinning. Okay. He's going to say here, yes. Okay. Whoever the highest angel was that sinned, there was a cause and effect relationship, and it did cause the others to sin. Article number 9 is really, really short. Whether those who sinned were as many as those who remained firm. Okay, were there more angels who fell or more angels who were blessed? And Thomas says, more angels stood firm than sinned, because sin is contrary to the natural inclination, while that which is against the natural order happens with less frequency, for nature procures its effects either always or more often than not. Okay, optimism, all right? More good things happen than bad things. Nature procures more things that work according to good than to bad, so therefore there must have been more angels that chose God than that did not choose God, right? All right, I know this was kind of a long haul, 9 articles, lots of information there about the demons, but it does bring us to tomorrow, our final question on the angels, which, as I mentioned before, will be about the punishment of the demons, how they're punished for making this bad choice against God. Thanks for watching and journeying through the Summa one question at a time with me, St. Thomas Aquinas. Pray for us. God bless you.